Thank you all so much for having me, and I'd like to thank the Decorative Arts Trust and William C. and Susan S. Mariner for their continued support of young scholars, or emerging scholars like me. I don't know if I can call myself young anymore. And I'd also like to thank Robert Hunter and Kurt Russ for being so supportive. The object in question for my presentation today, it was just so generous of them to say, would you like to study this for your Summer Institute project? Because it is an incredible piece. So, last summer, while participating in the Summer Institute, as Catherine mentioned, I had the good fortune of researching this fascinating jar for my traditional project. And as we will see, the piece offers a trove of visual treasures to unpack. But I eventually came to see that this face offers the key to unlocking their meanings. In my opinion, even when you factor in the jar's potential decoration as a commission for a client, this expression serves potentially as a form of self-portrait and simultaneous political commentary, making the decorator's feelings on the outbreak of the Civil War readily apparent to the viewer. Before I delve into this, we are going to be looking at a lot of problematic, if not offensive, imagery today. So just kind of to warn you, it's usually pretty violent. And additionally, in order to contextualize this piece within the broader field of visual culture, I'm going to be showing you a lot of troubling images. So let's dig in. So this jar is decorated with cobalt brushwork on all sides. Viewed from this angle, the unassuming 4-gallon jar looks like a paean to the Confederacy. It's marked with CSA initials for the Confederate States of America, and it is decorated with a shield with 3 bars and 8 stars, all surrounded with 4 tulip-like flowers. Turning the jar clockwise, the enthusiasm for Confederate victory becomes more violent, with a ghastly image of a figure hanging from gallows above the initials painted AL, right here, painted near the base. Coupled with the initials, the figure's distinctly long, thin legs and hairstyle suggest that it is intended to represent Abraham Lincoln. Other decorative elements include the notation of a 4 and 4 hash marks under the handle for the storage capacity. The Confederate shield and Abraham Lincoln's fates align, fitting into a growing iconography for the Confederacy. However, it's going to get more confusing. You turn the jar clockwise again, and it muddles the matter a little bit. Opposite the side from the CSA shield is a different one, with stripes, also surrounded by 4 tulips, and the word at the top of the shield has been faded a bit, probably during the firing process, but the beginnings of Union remain visible. Then you rotate the jar again, and it completes the confusing narrative, as now a different figure is hanged, with the name Jeff D. scrawled underneath. The face in question stares out from the other lug handle. Eyes narrowed and teeth bared, this is the epitome of frustration, perhaps with the need to choose a side, and anger directed into equal fates for the leader of the Union and the Confederacy. So, due to its coloration, subject, and cobalt brushwork, Robert Hunter and Kurt Russ have attributed this jar to the Richmond pottery of David Parr, or Kesey Parr, and its decoration to George N. Fulton, an Ohio native who worked in Parr's shop. We learned a little bit about Fulton yesterday when we were looking at that amazing Stoneware cooler for those of us who went to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. Formerly a china dealer in Baltimore, David Parr relocated to Richmond around 1852 with the support of Baltimore salt glazed stoneware manufacturer David Malden Perrine. And in 1857, Parr entered into a partnership with auctioneer Thomas Kesey, which lasted until 1862, when Parr brought his sons David Parr Jr., John L., and James into the partnership. Parr employed potters of numerous political persuasions and statuses within the pottery, which in the 1860 census of manufacturers listed 10 hands at work. It appears at least one of his sons fought for the Confederate States, as David Parr placed an advertisement in Richmond papers to be copied in national publications requesting information about Private John L. Parr, taken prisoner at Front Royal, Virginia on August 10, 1864. Another possible employee, Joseph B. Ramey, was injured fighting for the Confederacy in 1864. And the Parrs, we know, were not anti-slavery. In 1853, David Parr advertised that a man named Billy Holmes, whom he had rented from Captain Thomas Atkinson, had self-emancipated from his pottery at Rockets and offered a reward for his return. Yet Parr also wrote on behalf of Quaker Tillman Vestal after he was imprisoned in Richmond for objecting to his enlistment in the Confederate Army due to his pacifist beliefs, and Vestal subsequently worked at the Parr pottery for several years. George Fulton, however, enlisted in the Union Army in 1862. After the war, he eventually founded his own potteries on the western side of Virginia, first in Allegheny County, then possibly Botetourt County. Extant works from his own potteries are covered in elaborate, expressive brushwork decorations in cobalt and manganese, often helpfully paired with a very large signature. Decorative arts historians, I think we all can agree that this is great. We wish everybody did this. Now, it's important to remember that these potteries were fairly large, as Robert has been talking about, producing lots and lots of materials every single day. And with 10 hands, you have a lot of different individuals that work within these environments, all loading up kilns. So it's not, if you'll allow me to sort of conjecture a little bit, it's not outside the realm of possibility for someone to have just kind of slid this into the kiln and turned it so that nobody would see whatever side the decoration was on. Usually these kilns were stacked. This is a fantastic illustration of this from Oliver Muller-Harbach's dissertation on the subject, with lots of different pots all at once. So there is a possibility that this thing could have been sort of put away. So given the jar's attributed origins in Richmond, let's consider Virginia's specific political context during this period. Despite the Commonwealth's significant role in the Civil War, the discussion surrounding secession in the months leading up to its departure from the Union in April 1861 was more fraught than may be expected. There was a reason that secession was not immediate. And this is a cockade that you would wear if you were in support of secession. Few Virginians in the public sphere made arguments against the institution of slavery, or white supremacy, to be certain, but many fought against the idea of leaving the Union as the only means to preserve the United States, or preserve those institutions. In January 1861, a Richmond area legislator warned his constituents about disunionists who wished to bring about secession, claiming that, quote, "This union, which, if our internal dissensions can be allayed, is destined in glory, in wealth, in power to outstrip all other governments, can be preserved intact, can be maintained with equal rights to all parties to it if Virginia will pursue a determined but yet considerate course." And presciently warning that disunion, quote, "disunion is a remedy for none of the ills Virginia has to deal with. Its effect on her and the other border states would be particularly disastrous." They knew war would be horrible. Even as late as April 4th, 1861, 2/3 of Virginia's secession convention voted against a secession ordinance. So this was not necessarily a given at this point. Besides a general reluctance to leave the United States, Virginia had its own internal fissure with which to contend. Slavery's central role in secession was not lost on contemporaries, pitting enslavers in the eastern portions of the region, which this map really highlights the amount of enslaved individuals who were held by landholders here on the eastern side of the state versus what's happening on the western side, now West Virginia, who were far less, this pitted enslavers in the eastern regions of the Commonwealth against Westerners who were far less invested in the institution of slavery. Furthermore, Westerners implied their proximity to the North would put them at greater risk than those Easterners pushing for secession. As one assemblyman stated during deliberations over sending representatives to the secession conference in South Carolina in 1860, quote, "It was useless to talk of secession without war. The Ohio River would be a blaze of fire in 30 days after the Union was dissolved, and he thought he was as much interested as gentlemen living far from what would be the seat of war in the subject," end quote. Ultimately, the events at Fort Sumter brought about Virginia's secession, but not intact. The western portions of the state in turn seceded and eventually formed West Virginia as a state in the Union in 1863. Above, so here we have a detail of this CSA shield on the jar and a Confederate envelope. So I want to point out, we're examining the jar within this context of political fracture. The number of stars atop the Confederate States shield becomes critical. You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Unlike the official stars and bars, which first numbered 7 after the initial 7-state secession, and then 9 after Virginia and North Carolina joined in the spring of 1861, this shield is only topped by 8. While the decorator could simply have mistaken the number, I think this was an intentional decision, marking that moment when Virginia has decided to join in the Confederacy. The decorator's violent treatment of both sides' leaders also becomes more explicable in the context of Fort Sumter. So we have the traditional sort of understanding of this as the beginning of the Civil War, and just a sort of reminder for all of us. President Abraham Lincoln sent supplies, not additional troops, to Fort Sumter to avoid appearing as an aggressor. This is where he's kind of exercising a little bit of craft, and thereby tempt the Confederate States' newly elected President Jefferson Davis into launching an attack. So it's a way of not looking like an aggressor, but still making some action happen. Davis, in turn, accurately believed that other slave states, especially Virginia, would secede from the Union and join the cause if war broke out. So if this decorator were a particularly politically astute pro-slavery Unionist, it would not be a stretch for him to conceive of Virginia's position in the war as a tug of war between two treasonous gamblers deserving of identical fates. All right, so the decorator's imagery could have been inspired by any number of visual sources during this period, but the sardonic nature of the hanged figures correlates with the tone of contemporary political cartoons, which had become more abundant in the United States in the mid-19th century. Regular publication of political cartoons in widely circulating media was accelerated by the popularity of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, which was first published in 1855. Harper's Weekly and Vanity Fair followed in 1857, and the South added its own publication, Southern Punch, to the fray in 1860. Other popular prints, such as those by Currier and Ives, further added to this plethora of visual culture and iconographic permutations in the years leading up to and during the Civil War. Hanging Jefferson Davis was a common theme in political cartoons from the beginning of the war. So in this Currier and Ives print from 1861, Davis is draped in the stars and bars. Again, only 7 stars, not 8, not 9, standing on a platform at the gallows. And you can very much see the similarity in the structure of the gallows. Union soldiers also sang about hanging Jefferson Davis from the old sour apple tree from the beginning of the war. And this became another popular treatment of the Confederate president in contemporary media. The depiction of Jefferson Davis on the jar is now somewhat vague due to firing or perhaps a tentative initial application, but that of Abraham Lincoln is very distinct and easily comprehensible even without the initials. Contemporary caricatures of Lincoln, including those that portrayed him in a positive light, exaggerated the tall statesman's long legs. Likewise, the figure on the jar's odd splayed legs frequently are depicted in a similar manner in political cartoons. You can see kind of the positioning here. It's to exaggerate the length. You have him here again in the race with these kind of long, bent, angled legs. Further emphasizing his physique, the position echoes the numerous depictions of Lincoln riding a split rail that proliferated during his presidential candidacy. Also notable are the little strokes underneath Lincoln's chin, his whiskers. Lincoln famously grew whiskers in response to criticisms of his appearance during his election campaigns in 1860, most infamously from 11-year-old Grace Bedell. So this also kind of gives us a very specific date that this predate that this has to have been created after. Both of the hanged presidents, I should mention, are portrayed in a manner that's not as sort of solemn as one would expect of depictions of hanged figures, right? They have these kind of dancing figures. This one, Abraham Lincoln, almost looks like he's smiling a little bit. Their arms and legs are kind of in these odd positions. And here's another example of Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln sort of fighting in political cartoons. So here you've got another example of the hanged Jefferson Davis trope occurring in contemporary visual culture. His body is still. This is a deceased figure. It's gruesome. On this side, and again, very offensive imagery of Lincoln with kind of going through these various generals in the war, but I included this one because of the way the arms and legs on these kind of puppets, these different kind of puppets and toys, or jumping jacks, they have a striking similarity to the way these hanged figures are portrayed on the sides of this jar. So they almost appear as puppets or jumping jacks, and maybe some sort of allusion to the leaders being thoughtless, mindless, or even being easily manipulated by others. They're out of control. They're operating as puppets, rather than a sort of strict kind of or honest depiction of hanging. So this also is leading to the kind of political commentary, but a sort of a source of amusement embedded within these pieces. The expression on the face painted under the jar's handle is also similar to one found in contemporary political cartoons, especially those that depict a Miss Columbia, a personification of the United States. In one, published in Harper's Weekly in 1860, Miss Columbia is fashioned as a school teacher, presiding over a rowdy classroom and misbehaving congressmen/students. And her large eyes are narrowed and angular. So here you can see the way her eyes are, she has these large eyes and the eyebrows are coming down. And then here you have this very similar kind of face happening here. Registering her frustration with representatives from the North and South alike. In another cartoon from Harper's Weekly, published in 1861, Columbia has awoken and grasps a ghoulish figure, likely Jefferson Davis, by his neckerchief. Sorry. Her face is arranged in the same firm-lipped, angered expression as before, but this time she stands in front of a portrait, likely intended to invoke the spirit of a founding father. Rather than directly mimicking Columbia, I think that the decorator is applying the typical conventions of the period that were used to convey an individual's frustration and anger, as seen in these images of Columbia, to a caricature of George Washington. So, the cobalt sweep over the handle terminates in these slightly curved ends, very distinct, much like the curls of powdered hair or the fashions of the period around the face. And the face's toothy grimace, seen here, implies clenched jaws and references one of the first president's most infamously unseen features in his portraits. He sees what is happening to the United States and is not pleased, and is so displeased that he's going to show these teeth that he never shows. As much as this face presents George Washington's anger at the state of his legacy, or another founding father, it also likely serves as a self-portrait of the artist's emotional state. Admittedly, without knowing precisely, what the expectation or documentation of the attitudes of the decorator were toward the ongoing political strife and the outbreak of the Civil War, or if this piece was executed for a client, assigning a particular perspective or emotion to an artist runs a bit of a risk. However, no matter how humorous, the treatment assigned to Lincoln and Davis, as well as the conflicted nature of representing symbols of both sides in the Civil War, speaks to considerable frustration. If representative of the views of the decorator, George Washington becomes a proxy for the self. The Washington/decorator's face therefore serves as a marker of bearing witness, of watching the country deteriorate into chaos, and, whether due to death or position, being able to do little to stop it. As historian Michael E. Woods argues, Americans' understanding of emotions leading up to and during the Civil War played a critical role in their comprehension of political events and decision-making processes. In many instances, emotions were cited as the common bonding force for the country's disparate groups. Good feelings, or maintaining good feelings, rather than political or national ties, allowed the states to remain joined together harmoniously. Disruptions to these good feelings, sparked by abolitionists in the North or fanned by secessionists in the South, would, in this framing, naturally dissolve those bonds. Woods contends that various political groups played upon these ideas that emotional bonds could form communities, to then encourage the creation of separate sectional identities, essentially utilizing the discourse of emotion to amplify the key political and economic issues of the period. And similarly, Kyle Osborne has also asserted that the kind of righteous anger and hatred of the Yankee, encouraged by secessionists, served as a unifying element for Southerners, who in actuality had little more of a singular national identity than the remainder of the United States. Thus, the anger and frustration on display on the sides of the Richmond jar can be seen as twofold, partly at the leaders or groups that the decorator perceived as leading the country into war and chaos, and partly with the loss of an emotional community. Where, in this moment of mutual distrust and hatred, does the decorator belong? This storage jar, therefore, illuminates one of the forgotten paths that many Americans tread in the early stages of the Civil War, that of the unwilling participant. It offers an important reminder that, no matter our contemporary perspective or the predominance of particular tropes, the individuals who live through major historical events often experience them in a much more confusing fashion than our hindsight affords. Rather than the black and white clarity of historians' texts, the actual moment was, for many, a hopeless blend of blue and gray. Thank you.